The Chalcedon Foundation presents Freud, written by R.J. Rushdoony, narrated by Nathan F. Conkey. Foreword to the 2006 publication. Freud is not dead, declared the cover of Newsweek. The couch is out, but the culture of therapy is everywhere. The lexicon of our modern vocabulary contains lasting memorials to his ongoing influence. Anxiety, defense mechanism, denial, repression, subconscious, displacement, to name just a few. We feel a need to psychoanalyze others even if we do not want to submit ourselves to the process. Murder mysteries once focused on the intellectual effort of solving the riddle of clues. Now, television's crime and police shows cannot avoid depicting prosecutors and detectives analysing the suspects and apprehending them because they, as trained professional observers, understand the patient/criminal better than he understands himself. History has turned from the writing of deeds of important men to their psychology. Biography is now less the story of a person's life and impact, and more his struggle with the ghosts of his past. We do not feel we know a person unless we analyse him and pretend to know the source of his strengths and weaknesses. Freud's psychology is very much a part of our world. He is indeed still with us. It is fitting that this work by my father is republished now, on the 150th anniversary of the birth of Sigmund Freud. He has long been considered, along with Karl Marx and Charles Darwin, as one of the three most influential thinkers since the Enlightenment. The writers of the Newsweek cover story perceptively called him our secular St. Augustine. Freud would be pleased with such a synopsis of his impact, for the purpose of his life's work was the transferring of Augustine's doctrine of predestination from God to man's evolutionary ascent. The work that follows is a Christian critique of Freud's importance to modern thought and culture. His work provided the missing link that made possible the hegemony of science over modern man. Freud's work was an assault on the foundation of the Christian gospel, the precept that guilt is a moral fact and result of man's sin. Unlike most naturalists after Darwin who believed guilt was a cultural imposition on man, Freud believed guilt was, in fact, a real part of the human condition. He forced naturalists to assault and lay claim to territory that, until then, had been held exclusively by religion. His purpose was to explain guilt in terms of Darwinian naturalism. Freud's great contribution was the transference of guilt from an area of moral, and hence religious concern, to that of science. Guilt was said to come from man's primeval ascent. Freud formulated a complex historical construct to explain man's earliest prehistoric drives as oriented around cannibalism, homosexuality, incest, and parricide. These ancient impulses were forever implanted in the mind of man. In attempting to repress their impact, man became conflicted, and the subconscious effects of this struggle became an inescapable part of man's being. These repressed memories were hidden to the individual and only occasionally made their appearance in the form of dreams, Freudian slips, and mental, emotional, or behavioral disorders. Freud faced guilt as a scientist in order to remove its moral and religious connotations. He self-consciously pushed naturalism's science and its claims. Guilt as a moral fact was replaced after Freud with guilt as a scientific fact. In order to destroy the power of religion over naturalistic man, Freud replaced, as the author notes, God with Darwin's biological myth and Adam's fall into sin with his own anthropological myth. Freud's work was no less than an attack on all organized religion, which he held in contempt. The author notes that Freud, as a Jew, was particularly at war with Moses and the idea of divine law and the guilt it represented. To his credit, he did not pretend to offer a solution to guilt, only scientific explanation with the help of a professional psychoanalyst. The author shows that Freud's approach to guilt, then, was not aimed at its resolution, but its stoical acceptance as a biological predestination. Freud thus told man his hope was not in a religious absolution, but in a scientific explanation. By removing sin, Freud obviated the need for atonement in Jesus Christ. Those branches of Christianity that followed naturalistic science also soon gave up their atoning Messiah in favor of a more humanistic Christ figure. Sadly enough, however, Freud's concept of the human condition still left evolutionary man with a permanent guilt. His theories seemingly removed the stigma of sin, but he did not pretend to be able to remove the reality of guilt. To guilty man, all Freud could offer was scientific explanation consistent with Darwin. Health, he could urge, was understanding and accepting yourself. This is the closest modern humanism can come to salvation, the embracing of what Christianity calls the natural man. As a true post-Enlightenment figure, all he could really do was offer a rational scientific logic in a more consistent humanistic faith. The specifics of Freud's theories are now of little more than academic interest. It is Freud's repudiation of the Christian view of sin and guilt in favor of their anthropological explanation and acceptance that is still embraced as a fundamental tenet of humanistic man. Sigmund Freud's critics are legion, as are those of Marx and Darwin. The strength of each man's work is, however, its consistent application of humanistic thought. To reject the presupposition of any of these men is to run counter to the secular trend of thought since the Enlightenment. Modern man may not call himself Marxist, but he has accepted the basic tenets of socialism and lives in terms of them. Darwin's methodology was early found to be inadequate to explain evolution. It was quickly revised, however, because modern man believes in naturalism as the premise of his life, thought, and science. Likewise, Freud is often ridiculed, and psychology has splintered into many different revisions of Freud. But the core of his thesis, the naturalistic origin of guilt, is fundamental to modern man's evasion of his moral problem. To criticize Freud's core thesis on the basis of a supernatural faith is to invite a vicious response. Non-naturalists are not welcome at the intellectual bar of modern science. Critics are immediately trashed as religious fanatics who are themselves suppressing serious issues. After Freud, not only man's body, but also his psyche have belonged to naturalistic science. Religion is now warned to know its place, one of a purely personal nature. The answer to the naturalism of Darwin and Freud is still the supernatural. The gospel of Jesus Christ is still man's only hope. Man needs more than ever to be confronted with his sin and guilt as his moral failure before a holy God. An understanding of the error of Sigmund Freud must point us to what his work sought to evade: man's accountability to God and the atoning work of his mediator. From that point, we can establish a truly Christian approach to psychology, one from which Freud and humanists have long sought to escape.